Welcome everybody. I think we'll make a start for this second day of our symposium. Welcome to those of you who've come back this morning to join us for this session. And as you know, with this symposium, we're trying to bring together thinking about academic research and evidence and what it means to gather evidence, what kinds of evidence count in policymaking, with an understanding of the processes of policymaking and the political context in which policymaking takes place, and in order to give ourselves not just kind of interdisciplinary purchase on some of these questions, but also a sense of an understanding of how we relate to changes in the political world. So in that respect, we're delighted this morning to welcome, as our keynote speaker, Lord Kerslake. I think I hope I can spare his blushes by saying I think he's one of the most distinguished public servants of his generation. He was Chief Executive of Sheffield City Council. He then went on to become the Chief Executive of the Homes and Communities Agency, our national agency for housing and regeneration, then to become the Permanent Secretary at the Department of Communities and Local Government and the head of the Civil Service. And since leaving government and joining the House of Lords, he's taken on important public sector and charitable roles, chair of King's College NHS Trust, the Peabody Housing Association, and importantly, has worked a lot over the last year on questions of devolution, constitutional and political reform in the context of a changing United Kingdom, which has been profound in recent years, and of course with Brexit, challenges of how we relate to each other within the Union as well as relating to the European Union become incredibly important. So we're really pleased that you've been able to come and join us this morning, Bob, and we look forward to your remarks.
Thank you. Okay, well, good morning, everybody, and it is good to be talking in the city of my birth, in fact. Maybe you'll pick that up as I go along. The accent is still there a little bit. My kids tease me by trying to get me to say Cheddar Gorge, but and it works every time. It gets a laugh from them every time. Look, I wanted to talk today about what I think is a very important issue, and that's around constitutional reform. And the reasons why I think this is so fundamental. And I think the reference point for this really is the referendum. Now, in my view, there was no what has been called Portillo moment on the night of the referendum. The most memorable thing is the returning officer giving you the results of the different counts in different areas. Really, arguably, the Portillo moment came later in the political turmoil that followed the result of the referendum. Now, my favourite, as far as that's concerned, is Boris Johnson's announcement of his intention not to stand for the leader of the Conservative Party, to the evident shock and disbelief of not only his supporters, but the journalists as well. And if you look at the pictures of it, there is a journalist whose mouth is quite literally wide open in disbelief. That is my favourite Portillo moment, if I can call it that, from the referendum campaign. You'll no doubt have your own. Now, I think it's fair to say that the political turmoil from the result of the referendum is beginning to settle down, at least for the Conservative Party, if not for Labour. And a lot's been written about that political crisis. But I think actually the referendum result provoked, as much as anything, a constitutional crisis. And I think that is of equal, if not greater, magnitude. Now, the most obvious manifestation of that is the position of Scotland and whether there'll be another referendum post, if you like, Brexit on independence, or even before that. But I think the constitutional challenges for the UK go much, much deeper than this. And there isn't just one issue, there's a series of interconnected issues you have to consider and tackle together rather than in isolation. Now, in their desire to draw a line under what was a deeply divisive referendum campaign and move on, it's understandable that the government want to bury these issues. Brexit means Brexit, whatever that phrase actually means. We must now focus on the task of delivering it is where government is. And the country, that old phrase, needs stability after this political turmoil, and we therefore need to return to the business as usual and indeed politics as usual. Now, I get why they want to do that from their perspective. It's been a traumatic moment, if you like, in political terms. But in my view, it would be a grave mistake. I think the scale of the challenges we face constitutionally demand an open debate and a comprehensive response. Muddling through is simply not going to be enough. Now, there isn't time today to do justice to all these constitutional issues. I would recommend, if you're interested in this, in reading Vernon Bogdanov's brilliant paper on this issue. So what I'm going to concentrate on are just two particular issues. And I think the first one, and the one that I feel most passionately about, is devolution. For me, this is not just a question of a desirable change in policy. It is core to the reformed constitutional settlement. And indeed, the longer I was in central government, the more persuaded I was about the need for central government to do less and allow others to do more. The centralisation of this country, which is probably one of the most centralised, if not the most centralised country in the OECD, crowds out the capacity to make good decision-making at the centre of government. And I think it is a fundamental of that. So for me, greater devolution of spending and income raising, both to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, but crucially within England, is not just desirable, but it's essential to constitutional renewal. Now, last year I chaired an inquiry that looked at how we could deliver better devolution across the whole of the UK. And we had a very wide range of political views in that group, ranging from the Greens, the Conservatives, to Northern Ireland politicians, to obviously the main political parties. There was an overwhelming consensus from that group about the need for radical change. I think the review recommended and indeed supported and welcomed some of the devolutionary steps that have been made by the government, not least the so-called deal-based approach to delegation within England. But overall, we found that the government's approach had been piecemeal and incoherent. And in particular, there was not a consistent approach to the devolved nations. Devolution deals were too focused on cities and mayors and therefore excluded wide-ranging other areas from the conversation. Significant areas that really ought to be part of devolution were effectively excluded, such as education, from the negotiations. And I think last but not least, devolution of functions was what was up for debate, but devolution of functions has to be accompanied by much greater capacity to raise income locally. You can't simply devolve responsibility without devolving income-raising powers. That isn't devolution, that's decentralisation at best, and passing the buck at worst. So, given the lack of progress on devolution, I think it was reasonable for Greg Clark to argue that actually maybe the approach he was following was the best one, that actually what you should do is to embark on a journey without knowing where you're trying to end up, almost make a virtue of that. But our review saw real limitations in that approach. And the reason for that is this, really. Devolution is intrinsically disruptive to Whitehall, intrinsically disruptive. I remember when I was head of the civil service, we took forward an initiative on devolution to cities, the first one. And one of the permanent secretaries said, I'm perfectly okay with all of this devolution as long as it doesn't interfere with my national plans. And I kind of said to him, well, that is the point. So it is something that cuts across, if you like, the whole way in which Whitehall works. And it is disruptive. It's like a disruptive technology. It's a disruptive process. So unless you have a very powerful advocate in the form of someone like the Chancellor, it is too easy for individual deals to get watered down and reduced. or indeed get completely bogged down and make no progress. So for the government to succeed, our review felt that they needed to have a much clearer statement of their ambition, that you did have to think about where you're trying to get to, albeit that different places would move at different speeds. Now, in my personal view, events since the referendum have absolutely confirmed the doubts of the panel. We've seen the departure of George Osborne and the move of Greg Clark into a new role away from what has been his historic responsibility on cities. And that's taken out of government two of its most active champions of devolution, who had real power to make things happen. It's also fair to say that the devolution process for cities has hit some bumpy ground. Two of those devolution deals, which after all were the forerunners of a much wider devolution, have foundered. In the case of the North East, the deal is said to be off the table, quite literally off the table. In the case of Leeds City region, the local partners simply can't agree on the issue of a mayor. There are indeed suggestions that Theresa May has gone cool on the idea of devolution of mayors because she's worried that it will create alternative centres of power that might challenge the government. Again, I thought that was the point. So I think we could see, at best, if you like, a loss of momentum on devolution, and at worst, another failed initiative to move power away from Whitehall. And yet, I think the referendum has strengthened the case for devolution in a very compelling way. One of the key issues in the referendum was the imbalance economically between different parts of the UK. Devolution is key to economic rebalancing. We also face some really big challenges on our services, not least in health and care. And devolution offers the opportunity to join up those services at local level in a way that has so far defeated central government. Crucially for me, it can help close the gap between the governing and the governed. And that is, for me, one of the most dominant features of the outcome of the referendum, the loss of trust, if you like, in the people who government represent. And it is central, even in London, in my view, as our IPPR Housing Commission report found, to tackling what is, I think, a growing housing crisis in London. And again, last but not least, it can free up Whitehall to focus on the big strategic issues such as Brexit, rather than often find itself micromanaging the detail. And if you doubt what I say, I did sit through cabinet meetings where the issue of Starlings holding up the development of a single site in the Medway came up at least twice during a cabinet debate. Ask yourself, is that good use of cabinet time? It's also, by the way, politically popular devolution. An Ipsos Mori survey found that 79% of respondents trusted their council to make decisions on service provision in their local area, compared to just 11% for central government. And in the same survey, 82% of the respondents supported giving councils more devolution. So this is a policy that doesn't just, if you like, go with the grain of what's right constitutionally. It also could be, in my view, politically popular as well. And I think a bold approach to devolution would have at least these two components. First of all, transforming the Union, the United Kingdom, into a voluntary, and I emphasize that word, voluntary union of nations, united by a common set of values and principles. The so-called reserve powers model should apply to all the devolved nations, and the most rigorous test should not be what should we devolve, but what should we reserve. And crucially, Scotland should be free to decide whether, when, and how it holds another referendum. That should not be something for the UK to make a decision on. But, and this is a crucial point, it should be clear, in a way it wasn't for the EU referendum, what would be the terms of departure. So have a referendum whenever they want it, however they want it, but be clear what the consequences of that referendum outcome would be for the people of Scotland. This is a crucial issue, it seems to me, that we need to be clear on. And the second thing for me would be a really serious exercise to define what a full devolution model in England would look like. And crucially, what the stages towards that model would be. It doesn't need to be the same in every part of England. It doesn't need to go at the same speed, but we do need a set of clear and consistent organisational principles. You do have to say, where are we trying to get to on this agenda? Now, let me just make, before I go on to my second key constitutional theme, two important points in passing. Firstly, it's important to say this will be a move towards a more federal model, but it would not be full federalism. Why do I say that? Well, it's because of the nature of the United Kingdom. England, if you like, has a huge imbalance, the UK has a huge imbalance, with England constituting 85% of the population. In such situations, there is no other precedent for a federal, truly federal model working with that scale of imbalance between the different components of the federation. And therefore, you will always face an asymmetry. You will always face an asymmetry in the relationship. And therefore, there has to be a situation in which the smaller nations do have an ability to input and contribute on the decisions of the larger component of the federation. And as Vernon Bogdana has said, asymmetry is the price we pay for retaining the union. So more federal, but not fully federal. The second point I'll make in passing is that you have to accept with devolution that there will be different choices and therefore different outcomes. Different places will make better decisions than others, and that will impact on outcomes. It will impact on services, and it will impact on attainment and so on. You cannot avoid that with devolution. If you can't live with different outcomes, and that may be the view on things like the National Health Service, you have to accept that the devolution can't be a full one. But devolution will lead to different results. But, and this is the crucial point, we have different results now. Centralism hasn't produced equal outcomes or equal opportunity even. What is absolutely crucial is that you put each place in the same position to succeed. They have equal, to use the term, capability. That is crucial, and to do that, you have to redistribute resources. There is no other way of doing it but to redistribute resources. So you will have different outcomes, but you must start from a position of equal capability. Let me move on to my second key constitutional theme. So I think greater devolution is an essential part of constitutional reform, but it's not enough. Equally important, in my view, is to reform our voting system. Now, let me just give you some statistics on this. In 1955, the Conservative Party won power with 314 seats and 38% of the total electorate voting for them. All those people able to vote, 38%. 60 years later, in 2015, they won power and 331 seats, more seats, but with the support of just 24% of the electorate. Extraordinary. And it was, in fact, the most disproportionate election outcome in UK history. It did not represent, as an outcome, how people voted. And there's a very simple reason for that. And that's because we have inexorably moved from being a two-party to a multi-party country. And our current first-past-the-post voting system fails in every respect to reflect this new reality. And this is as true locally in local elections as it is nationally. It's not just a national issue. In my view, the effect of this is to encourage a tribal approach to politics that focuses on core votes and marginal seats. And you could see that, I could see that in the last government, absolutely. Why did housing, just give me one example, why was social housing so toxic for the last Conservative government? Very simple, a leading member of that government, you can make your own conclusions, thought that more social housing equaled more Labour voters. It's as simple as that. Extraordinary. That's what I call tribal politics. And it's not just there were more Labour voters, it would be more Labour voters in seats that might be at risk. And so those people who are not part of those areas being wooed, cultivated, feel utterly excluded from the political process. And there's a very relevant corollary to that issue, if you like, and that's the decline of marginal seats that was represented in the 2015 election. And there's an excellent blog by three professors, Ron Johnson, Charles Patty and David Manley, on the LSE website, which I'd encourage you to read. And let me just summarise some of the key points from it. The surge in the SNP in Scotland meant that many former marginal seats are now completely out of the reach of Labour. In constituencies where the Liberal Democrats came second in 2010, their share of the vote in 2015 went to the Greens and UKIP rather than to the next biggest opposition party. And the consequence of that was that there was very little change in the total number of seats for the major parties when you add them up together, but there was a huge change in the number of safe seats for those parties. So if you take very safe as your definition, i.e. a 20% margin of victory, the Conservative gained 60 safe seats out of that process, going from 148 to 208, despite their share of the vote only going up by 0.8%. Labour gained 20 very safe seats, going from 115 to 135, with an additional 1.5% of the vote. But of course, the consequence of that is that there are far more, let's call them hopeless seats for both parties. Labour went from 248 to 284, and the Conservatives from 168 to 200. So if you are a supporter of the other party, let's call it that, in those seats, you are far less likely now to have your view understood, represented, reflected. And anybody who lives in a safe seat will know exactly what I'm talking about here. So much has been made of the mountain that Labour has to climb to have any chance of forming a majority next time. And it is indeed a huge mountain. The boundary changes will cause huge disruption, and indeed not just for Labour. There are some real debates about whether the rigid approach to the size of such constituencies is right. But actually, I think as big, if not bigger, issue is that it's being done on an out-of-date register, which in fact excludes some 2 million voters who did register during the referendum campaign, when there's a simple alternative, as the Electoral Reform Society said, of using population. And notwithstanding the fact that that was in the legislation, I think it has to be revisited. It is indefensible, in my view, to use data that is so completely out of date. But notwithstanding all of that, and those are really important here and now discussions, the next general election will still be undertaken with an electoral system that is woefully unfit for purpose, defined for a two-party system that no longer exists, and condemning a vast number of voters to having no ability to impact on the outcome in their area. This is the point at which people say, well, what about the alternatives? You know, aren't they just as bad? Well, actually, to quote an Hour in Bevan, who's not quoted that often these days, you don't have to look at the crystal ball, you can look at the book. Scotland has a PR system for both the Scottish Parliament and the local elections. So why not take that as the starting point for the discussion on England and Wales? There is no practical impediment to changing our voting system. It's only an issue of political will. Now, until recently, these constitutional issues have been somewhat below the radar. But I think there are a growing number of people and organisations pushing for constitutional reform. And recently, in the light of both the Scottish and the EU referendums, there's a much stronger call for what's called a constitutional convention, which the Electoral Reform Society has defined as a process for involving members of the public in making decisions about the constitutional shape of their country. And there is an example of this in the Scottish Constitutional Convention that paved the way to the Scottish Parliament. Now, we've always, as I've said earlier, had a piecemeal approach to these issues about how our state functions. And that's, if you like, typified by the fact that we have a so-called unwritten constitution as opposed to a codified, legally binding convention. And I would venture to suggest that one of the reasons why we have seen it so easy to reduce powers for local government is the lack of that constitutional protection. We've seen, if you like, a rush of constitutional change in the late 90s, and more recently, as I've said, we've seen devolution and the so-called English votes for English laws. But one thing conspicuously absent from the constitutional debate has been the engagement of the public in that discussion. It has been a top-down Whitehall process. And one of the people now, somewhat surprisingly giving his history, who's now advocating a much more open approach is Gordon Brown, who has argued for much greater devolution of powers to Scotland as a way of diluting the case for independence, but also for a UK-wide constitutional structure, a convention that allows debate to open up. I'm a supporter of this. I think such a convention that engages both the public and the political parties would move the debate from being a solely Whitehall-focused, Westminster-focused conversation. The public, in other words, needs to be drawn in. And let me just perhaps deal with two final issues before I finish. Firstly, because it always comes up, should we have a second referendum on the EU? Now, my personal view on this, it is the wrong question to ask at this time, so recently after the vote. But we should return to this question once we're clearer what the terms of departure will be. Promises were made by the Brexiteers, I wasn't one of them, I have to say, that we would see major reinvestment of savings back into the NHS, that we would see tightly controlled immigration and a continuation of free trade and economic growth, that Britain would have a brighter future with more influence in the world and not less. These were very specific promises as part of the vote for Brexit. And we need to see whether these promises are delivered. If they are, then a second referendum would probably be redundant. If they fall short, then those who advocated remaining, I think, are entitled to say we should have a second vote. My second issue, and I can't possibly duck this, is should the House of Lords be replaced by an elected chamber? I am, of course, party pre. There is clearly a good case for change. We are an outlier in the way we run our country. And as somebody who's now been in the Lords for a while now, perhaps the best thing about it is that I feel young again. It's a long time since I've been the young whippersnapper, and but more seriously, the future of the House of Lords needs to be resolved through open debate and through the political process. And if the outcome of that for the political parties is that we replace the current chamber with an elected one, I wouldn't resist that. I can see why that case is made. The Commons would have to accept that there was a second chamber with greater authority to amend legislation than at present. One of the reasons it's left as it is because it allows the party in government, to say you have no legitimacy. Basically, it's a way of, and trust me, that happens when you challenge legislation. So I think it suits government to leave the House of Lords in its current state. But my personal view is whichever way we go, and if we go down the appointed route rather than the elected route, there's plenty of room for reform. And I have my suggestions list in a file to be released at the appropriate moment. Now, let me just conclude. I think we ignore this constitutional crisis and the one that's been exposed by the referendum at our peril. I've argued on 2 areas for radical change, but there are many more that are needed. It's essential, if we're going to get this right, that we have an open debate that is not just dominated by the great and the good. And I'm absolutely certain of one thing, and that is that we can't carry on as we are. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Lord Kerslake. I mean, for somebody that's been sort of right at the heart of the establishment, if I may say, put it like that, that was a very kind of democratic contribution, as well as a very wide-ranging one. I mean, it touched on almost all the aspects of change that are required in the UK on constitutional and democratic issues. So we've got an opportunity to open up and to ask some questions. I'm going to start with one which is about the sort of politics of identity in England. You argued very strongly for all of England to benefit from devolution, and not simply the cities and the urban areas. And yet, large parts of the country, and this is where we are in Bath, is an interesting example of this. There's a proposal for the 3 authorities, Bristol, South Gloucestershire and Bath and North East Somerset, to come together with an elected mayor. And very good reasons for policy to do that. But this is not an area where you might think of there being a kind of distinct and strong identity, as you might find in Greater Manchester or in Liverpool or in Cornwall and so on. How far do you think the kind of politics of devolution require some kind of strong underpinning identity for that devolution to work?
It's a really interesting question, and I think devolution has had a number of different drivers, Nick. I mean, the one that George Osborne advocated, which I think has huge strength to it, by the way, is that it is crucial, as I said, to tackling economic imbalance, that the cities are key to economic growth in the future, and that you need to create, if you like, natural economic footprints, so it's not just about identity, it's about economic footprint that can act as leaders and drivers of economic development and therefore rebalancing the economy. So-called Northern Powerhouse would be, if you like, the manifestation of that. That's one dimension of devolution. There's a second dimension of devolution, which is to say it's important, as I said earlier, to unlock service reform, that you cannot make the sorts of changes we need. And then the third one, I guess, which is what's driven Scotland and Wales, which is identity. But it hasn't been identity driven in the UK. And I think the interesting question is that likely to emerge? Or indeed, are we finding that the ambition to do economically driven devolution cuts across the identity? And I think I think this really, I think we should commit to greater devolution full stop, actually, and government should do that. Because actually, I think the core argument is that we would get better government from it and better decision making, almost whatever I think government might well encourage a debate about what are the right structures to deliver particular ambitions, but all previous governments, and that includes this one, can't resist the temptation to tell areas in the country what's good for them. So we talk here about the west of England. As a kind of joining up. We also have a suggestion, more than a suggestion, an expectation that if you're going to get devolution to Norfolk and Suffolk, you've got to have a mayor for Norfolk and Suffolk. Well, come on. I mean, it's just ridiculous. I mean, it's just... So why does central government feel that it has to define the benefits of devolution. Right? In some places, identity matters hugely. In other places, it will be about better decision making. In other places, it will be about economic growth and development. And the only test government should say is, if your ambition is economic growth, have you thought about the structures correctly? Do you see what I mean? Yeah. So I don't think we'll ever have a simple answer in the UK. Yorkshire has a clear identity, historically, I think. It certainly has a clear attitude, I'll put it that way. Got to be careful here, this is being recorded. But other places don't. And one of the I think the failures of the regional model was that it tried to impose, if you like, boundaries that never worked. So why not let places develop the model for devolution? What I think is crucial, though, and this is a sort of last point I make on this, is that you can't end up with a world where, if you like, the transfer the remoteness and the closed nature of politics from kind of central to local without having proper accountability of those new local structures. So combined authority is fine, but they've got to be subject to scrutiny and challenge as much as local authorities are.
Great, let's do some more. So Jeff and then David, yeah.
Really fascinating presentation, thank you. It's really good. The one point you made about devolution offering the opportunity to join up local services. Some may argue that there's a paralysis of a blame culture and audit, which stops that happening. And others, the cynic may argue that devolution just apportions blame more locally rather than keeping it at central government. I don't know what you think about that.
I think there's a risk. I think it is a risk for government to say, well, we've handed you the powers and responsibilities. And that, I think, comes particularly if what you do is hand over responsibility without, if you like, financial bandwidth, if you like. I think that's got to be part of the deal. But I do genuinely think, from my experience, that some of the problems that we just seem to escape us at national level, particularly joining up health and care, would be more easy to unlock at local level. But it has to be great kind of care about how it's done, because what we have in this country is a kind of, the way I would describe it is this: you can either have a wide range of services and a wide financial base at local level, or you can have a narrow range of services or a narrow financial base. What is problematic is to have a wide range of services and a narrow financial base. And that's why local government is so unstable, basically. Why we're facing these desperate problems in care at the moment, which really are, I think, kind of untenable. And so, yes, devolution can help, but it's got to be part of a package of things you do. And one of those things in the package has to be greater financial autonomy at local level.
David, and then I'll come to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Absolutely, really enjoyed that a great deal. So many questions. I'll just stick to a short few. The first one is sort of tying into the question you had there as well. Is there sometimes a danger with devolution that power can still be centralised, but at another level? I mean, I'm looking at the Scottish case, for example, where you've actually seen this huge centralisation from the Scottish Parliament with council taxes capped, etc., and services being sort of sucked to a sort of a new level away from localism. And I was wondering if there's a danger of that in the case for what we used to call double devolution.
Yeah, it is a risk, and this came up quite kind of consistently in our evidence gathering, if you like, for the review. And it's a tricky one, this, isn't it? Because if you're going to devolve to Scotland and Wales, you have to, in a sense, devolve. We can't say we'll devolve, but only if you do it in the way we think you should do it, really. That has to be a debate in Scotland and Wales about the value of devolution. I would like to think and hope that we'll see devolution to the lowest level, because we won't increase the sense of people owning government. I mean, I used to rail, when I was in Sheffield as chief exec, I used to rail against the remote and unresponsive central government. I did it less when I was in the head of civil service. But the serious point here is that, you know, I was very aware that people in Darnall in East Sheffield felt the same way about Sheffield City Council. So, you know, you do have to have open politics up to all the way down. That's why I'm a great fan of neighbourhood councils, neighbourhood planning. I think they're great initiatives, actually. I know everybody agrees with them. But I wonder if we can dictate that to Scotland and Wales. I think they've got in a way to make their own decisions and sometimes their own mistakes on these things.
Okay, so I can just one very small one following up. Is
He's
an issue
writing a book on devolution, by the way.
sorry.
Right, cool, God.
On an issue sort of statescraft and the way we talk about this when we think about the union,
Yeah.
I was hoping I could take you back to the morning after the referendum for Scotland when the Prime Minister came out and gave a speech to the nation. And I was wondering what you, listening to that speech, thought about how he approached that referendum.
This is when he made the point about English votes for English laws. Is that?
Yeah, I was insufferably arrogant, wasn't it? I was blunt about it. I mean, I just think, I really thought that, I mean, the view was that the result vindicated the campaign for Scotland. I didn't think it did at all. I think the result was in spite of some of the approach to the campaign in Scotland rather than because. And that lesson, we won Scotland, so we'll apply the same model for the EU, was in part of the undoing of the EU campaign, in my honest opinion, actually. It was kind of high-handed. As actually one of the ministers put in cabinet, it was rather like, I won't say which one it is, I'm sorely tempted to, but I won't. He said that the Scottish campaign was rather like your young teenage child saying to him, look, this is really a bad idea, you mustn't take that risk, you know, you shouldn't be doing that. And being surprised when they go ahead and do it anyway. I mean, it was patronising and, in my view, arrogant to the campaign. And we won it, if you like, if you're a supporter of the union, which I am, in spite of rather than because of it. But I think it sowed the seeds of a misjudged campaign for the EU.
Very interesting. Colleague here, yeah.
A question on your other key component, electoral reform. Could you comment on the coalition's attempt at that? I think it was called AB2 and how that squid, and also who's talking about it now, who's sort of trying to champion it?
Well, I think there are a number of people championing it now. I think the first point I make is, why was that a damn squid? Well, AV isn't PR. It was as Nick Clegg said in a point he wished he hadn't said, it was a miserable compromise, I think. And it also then became kind of symbolised by, if you like, one party, which at that point was at the lowest point in its unpopularity when we had the vote. So yeah, and I think those two things combined with a pretty ruthless campaign against it resulted in the outcome we saw. By the time we get to, let's say, the 2020 election, we're some time on from that, and I think the evidence now, is the argument for this. Who's advocating it? Well, organisations like the Electoral Reform Society have consistently advocated it. I personally think, I've got no complete evidence to back this, that there will be more appetite for changing the voting system in Labour than there has been historically. And I think part of the reason for that is that I don't think Labour can easily win power again on their own. So some form of collaboration is going to be needed. So who's advocating it? Organisations who are campaigning on the issue at the moment, but I think in due course it will move back into, if you like, serious political advocacy as well.
Thank you. So, did you want to? You had your arm up earlier. Yes, sorry, I missed you last time. And then, yeah.
Thank you very much. My question is similar to the previous one. I'm really curious about where the leadership for the changes, where you think these can come from, and what are the mechanisms of changes beyond, because our electoral system, the elections, aren't producing the changes, the profound changes that are needed. So who and how, really?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think I have wholly the answer on that, if I'm honest with you. I think what I would say is that potentially, if you like, the breakdown of party authority creates the space for more grassroots political movement, really, and local choice. One of the ideas I kind of advocated in the review we did, the devolution review, was why not let local areas make the decision whether they have PR or first past the post in their local elections. Why not let them make the choice, So I think we could see it coming from the bottom up. I think we are seeing a number of organisations, both kind of central government and, more central Westminster organisations, increasingly as a constitutional reform group that's been established to explore these issues. And I personally think it will, once the Labour Party's got through its current turmoil, return to kind of the debate for the Labour Party as well. So I think, and you could see it therefore forming a common platform, if you like, for a number of parties going into the next election. Will that be enough? I don't know. But it's amazing how things do emerge in the political process.
Just here, yeah. Steve, Steve.
I think you make a very compelling case on all fronts.
Thank you.
I'm just concerned that Brexit will be all for the next 3, 4, 5 years, and the civil service will be completely consumed by that in the UK government and in Scotland and Wales. So I'm wondering whether you're making a case for change 10, 15 years down the line, or whether you think some of these changes are realistic in the shorter term.
Yeah, it's a fair challenge, and I've reflected on that myself. I think Brexit will be dominating, notwithstanding the desire of government for it to be otherwise. My personal view is that the process will be more complex, more difficult and longer than anybody is understanding at the moment. And there is no hard and simple route. Just to give you one point, it's not simply about negotiating an exit. There's a whole raft of legislation that has to be replaced, quite honestly. And this is in a civil service that's been reduced by a quarter. So there are serious issues about capacity. You're quite right to raise that. So do I think the current government will jump at constitutional reform? Absolutely not. It's going to have to be others. But I think you've got to start somewhere. And if you look at campaigns that have come to fruition, they do take time. They might take 5 years, they may even take 10, but you've got to start somewhere.
Yes, thank you very much for your very interesting and compelling argument indeed. The question that arises for me is, how do you envisage the health services to be both protected and available to these various populations? I think in the current scenario where we are having a big demand in all areas, it's probably an issue that we need to consider.
It's completely an issue we need to consider. I think, indeed, I would say one of the unifying principles that might form part of any voluntary union would be a free NHS service, free at the point of delivery. I'll make 2 or 3 points on it. One is we have the most efficient healthcare system, actually. If you look at any of the others, it is more efficient in the way it works in terms of the money. Second point is we are seeking to run it on a level of our national budget that is unsustainable. You get to 2020, we're on maybe 7-8% of GDP. Most Western countries are over 10. So it's not sustainable, and nothing but more money will make it sustainable. Typically, the NHS has needed 4% real growth to stand, if you like, just to keep its head above water. And any time it hasn't had that, it's got into difficulty, and that's what Labour faced, I think, Nick, it's fair to say, and that's what we're facing now. We're heading full steam ahead to another major financial squeeze, in my view, on the NHS. So my personal view about the answer is, actually, is on this one, is that we should open up a debate about really what this country wants for its health service and how much we're prepared to pay for it. I would establish a commission. It doesn't have to be a royal commission, but it has to be of serious standing. Not in the sense to develop the technical arguments, because they exist. We know these things that I've just said. But actually to engage in a public debate about the future of the NHS. And if we do that, we'll find a way of paying for it. We will. I can tell you ways of doing it, but they're not the point, really. We just decide that the health, the future security of our health. And by the way, it's not health, it's health and care. We need an independent commission to look at health and care, to report on, to engage in debate with the public, and then report on what the response should be. That's my strong view on this. And anything less than that, and we'll just keep staggering year to year in a crisis. None of that is to say the health service can't get more efficient. It can. But it cannot make up that gap. It can't make it up. There's just no way it will.